Of all the silences in the world, the one that presses in on you in the deep woods is the most alive. It's a silence that breathes, that watches, that holds the memory of every snapped twig and rustled leaf from 1,000 years past. It was this living quiet that first greeted Emily Carter when the taxi, a brave little vessel of yellow in a sea of green and brown, finally crunched to a halt on the gravel drive. The letter had been a shock, arriving at her cramped city apartment like a relic from another time. The paper was thick, creamy, the ink a faded black, informing her of the passing of a grandmother she'd only ever known through brittle, yellowed photographs. Eleanor Carter had been a ghost long before she'd actually become one, and now she had left Emily a house. Not just any house, but a mansion, the letter had said, tucked away in the misty heart of rural Vermont. For Emily, who felt as worn and weary as the city pavement she walked every day, it was less an inheritance and more a lifeline. Her job was a dead end, her relationship had withered on the vine a month prior, and the four walls of her apartment were closing in, suffocating her with the scent of stale dreams and instant noodles. Vermont sounded like a breath of fresh air she hadn't realized she was desperate to take. But the house was not what she had imagined. Mansion was the right word, but it was a mansion in mourning. It stood before her, a grand, decaying queen of a bygone era, its Victorian bones draped in peeling paint and creeping ivy. The gables were ornate, like the lace on a funeral shroud, and the wide, weathered porch sagged in a permanent sigh. It was a house that had given up. Long, skeletal shadows stretched from its frame, clawing at the wild, overgrown gardens that had once, perhaps, been beautiful. "This is it, miss," the taxi driver said, his voice a little too loud in the stillness. He eyed the house with a mixture of pity and something else, maybe fear. "The Carter place." Emily paid him, her hands fumbling with the bills. She felt a strange, protective urge rise in her chest. It was her house now, her mess to clean up, her ghost to live with. As the taxi retreated down the winding lane, its sounds swallowed by the trees, Emily was left alone with the breathing silence and the imposing structure that was now, impossibly, hers. The key, a heavy, ornate piece of iron, felt cold in her hand. It turned in the lock with a groan of protest, the sound echoing through the cavernous space beyond. The air that rushed out to meet her was thick with the scent of dust, damp wood, and forgotten time. It was the smell of a place that had been holding its breath for a very long time. Stepping inside was like stepping into a photograph. The grand foyer was dominated by a sweeping staircase, its banister smooth and dark under her hesitant touch. Lining the walls were the portraits of her ancestors, their faces pale and serious, their eyes seeming to follow her as she moved. Women with high collars and severe expressions, men with stiff beards and unwavering gazes. They were the Carters, her family, and every single one of them looked unbearably sad. She left her single scuffed suitcase at the foot of the stairs and began to wander. The house was a labyrinth of rooms, each one draped in white sheets, like sleeping giants. She pulled one back in what must have been the parlor, revealing a velvet chaise lounge, its deep burgundy faded to a dusty rose. A grand piano stood silently in the corner, its keys yellowed like old teeth. Everything was preserved, yet decaying, a perfect, heartbreaking time capsule. As she moved through the echoing halls, a chill began to seep into her bones that had nothing to do with the autumn air outside. It was a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to emanate from the very walls. She'd find pockets of it, sudden and startling, in the middle of a hallway or the center of a room. She'd wrap her thin cardigan tighter, dismissing it as a draft from a broken window pane. But the feeling lingered. The first night was the hardest. She'd managed to find a bedroom that felt less like a tomb than the others, dragging her suitcase up the groaning stairs. The bed was a four-poster monstrosity, and she felt small and lost in its vastness. The house settled around her, a series of creaks and groans that she told herself were just the sounds of an old structure breathing. The wind, she thought, was whistling through the eaves. The pipes were rattling in the walls. There was a rational explanation for everything. But then, as she lay on the precipice of sleep, she heard it. A whisper. It was faint, so faint she almost missed it, like the rustle of silk or the sigh of a dying fire. It was a soft, sibilant sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She sat up, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The room was silent, bathed in the pale, milky light of the moon, filtering through the grimy window. "Hello?" she called out, her voice sounding thin and foolish in the oppressive quiet. There was no answer, only the groaning of the house, the sighing of the wind. She lay back down, pulling the heavy quilt up to her chin. It was her imagination, the stress of the move, the unfamiliarity of the place. It had to be. But as she closed her eyes, she heard it again, a little closer this time. A soft, pleading murmur that slid through the cracks in the floorboards and the space beneath the door. It was a woman's voice, she thought, or maybe several. And though she couldn't make out the words, she could feel the emotion behind them. A deep, profound sorrow that seemed to soak into the very air she was breathing. That night, sleep did not come. Emily lay awake, a prisoner in her own house, listening to the secrets the walls were trying to tell her. The next few days were a blur of determined activity. Emily waged a war against the decay, her weapon a bucket of soapy water and a stack of rags. She scrubbed floors, washed windows, and aired out the musty rooms, trying to chase away the ghosts with sunlight and the scent of lemon polish. She unpacked her few belongings, placing her worn paperbacks on the dusty shelves and her favorite mug in the cavernous kitchen. She was trying to impose her own life onto the house, to overwrite the sorrow with her own quiet existence. But the house resisted. The cold spots remained, shifting and moving like unseen presences. The lights in the hallway would flicker and die, only to blaze back to life when she was in another room. And always, there was the feeling of being watched. She'd be washing dishes and feel a prickle on the back of her neck, a certainty that one of the painted faces in the foyer had turned its head to look at her. The whispers continued, growing bolder. They were no longer confined to the dead of night. She'd hear them in the late afternoon, a faint chorus of sighs as she folded laundry. She'd catch a snippet of a word, a name, as she climbed the stairs. Eleanor, they seemed to say. Sarah, Abigail. Names she vaguely recognized from the family tree she'd found in a dusty book. Driven by a mixture of terror and a desperate need for answers, she began her own investigation. If the house wouldn't give up its secrets, she would tear them from its grasp. Her search led her to the attic, a space so thick with dust it felt like another world. Cobwebs hung like macabre chandeliers, and the air was still and heavy. In the far corner, under a mound of moth-eaten blankets, she found it, a large leather-bound trunk, secured with a rusty lock. It took a crowbar from the old shed and a good deal of swearing, but finally, the lock gave way with a sharp crack. The scent that rose from the trunk was of lavender and old paper. Inside, it was a treasure trove of a forgotten life, her grandmother's life. There were stacks of diaries, bound in faded leather, their pages filled with elegant, spidery script. There were strange trinkets, a silver locket that wouldn't open, a bundle of dried herbs tied with a black ribbon, a single child-sized porcelain doll with a cracked face. And there were the photographs, faded sepia-toned images of women, so many women. They stood on the porch of the house, their faces solemn, their long dresses blending into the shadows. They were all Carters, all bearing the same high cheekbones and deep-set, sorrowful eyes that Emily saw in her own reflection. She took the diaries back down to the kitchen, the one room that felt remotely safe, and began to read. As she lost herself in her grandmother's words, a storm began to brew outside, the sky turning a bruised purple. The wind howled around the house, rattling the windows in their frames, and as the first drops of rain began to fall, the whispers returned, louder and clearer than ever before. They were in the room with her. "He's coming," one voice sighed, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "She shouldn't be here," another hissed, sharp and angry. Emily's head snapped up from the diary. The voices were weaving around her, tangible, real. They weren't just in the walls anymore. They were swirling in the air, echoing the names and events she was reading about on the page. They spoke of a woman named Sarah, trapped in a loveless marriage. They lamented the fate of Abigail, who had vanished one winter without a trace. They were the voices of the women in the photographs, their stories bleeding through the veil of time. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. This was not the wind. This was not her imagination. The house was haunted, not by one ghost, but by a legion of them, and they were all her family. The need for supplies, and for a human voice that wasn't a disembodied whisper, drove Emily from the house and into the nearby town. It was a quaint, picture postcard place, with a white-steepled church and a general store that smelled of coffee and sawdust. The locals were polite but distant, their smiles not quite reaching their eyes when they learned where she was staying. "The old Carter place," the woman at the grocery checkout said, her voice dropping. "Brave of you." It was in town's small, dusty library that she met Jack. He was the town historian, a man with kind eyes, a tweed jacket, and an encyclopedic knowledge of local lore. When Emily mentioned the Carter house, his expression shifted from professional curiosity to genuine concern. "That house has a reputation," he said, leaning forward across a table piled high with books. "A dark one. They say it's cursed." He told her the stories, the local legends that had been passed down for generations, tales of misfortune that befell every woman who lived there. Sudden illnesses, tragic accidents, women who simply disappeared. The townspeople whispered that the house itself was hungry, that it consumed the women of the Carter bloodline. "Of course, it's mostly just superstition," Jack added quickly, seeing the color drain from Emily's face. "But the history is real. I've seen the records. There's a pattern of tragedy there that's hard to ignore." The drive back to the mansion was filled with a new kind of dread. The whispers of the villagers echoed the whispers in the house, weaving a tapestry of fear that was becoming impossible to deny. That night, the haunting escalated. The nightmares began. She dreamt she was not herself. She was Sarah, running through the endless, twisting corridors of the house, her bare feet cold on the floorboards. A dark, shadowy figure pursued her, its form indistinct, but its malice a palpable force. She would wake up screaming, the sheets tangled around her, her heart hammering against her ribs. The next night, she was Abigail, scratching desperately at a window that wouldn't open, the winter snow piling up outside, trapping her within the suffocating walls. The apparitions started soon after. A fleeting glimpse of a woman in a white dress at the top of the stairs, a shadowy figure standing at the end of a long, dark hallway, vanishing when she blinked. She'd catch sight of a face in a mirror, not her own, but one of the sorrowful women from the photographs, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth open in a silent scream. The whispers were no longer just voices. They were accompanied by physical sensations, a cold, invisible hand brushing against her cheek as she slept, the distinct feeling of fingers tugging at the hem of her shirt. The house was reaching for her. trying to pull her into its dark embrace. With Jack's help, the pattern became horrifyingly clear. They spent hours poring over old town records, newspaper clippings, and the diaries from the trunk. Every generation, a Carter woman had died within the house, always under mysterious or violent circumstances: a fall down the grand staircase, a sudden wasting sickness, a disappearance that was never solved. It was a relentless, unbroken chain of tragedy, and Emily was the next link. "It's not just bad luck, Emily," Jack said, his voice grim as he pointed to a faded death certificate from 1888. "This is a curse. Something is bound to that house and to your family." The house seemed to know its secrets were being unearthed. Its malevolence grew, turning from passive haunting to active aggression. One stormy night, as the wind howled like a banshee, the house decided to show its true power. Emily was in the library, a fire crackling in the hearth, when the lights suddenly went out, plunging her into darkness. When she tried to leave the room, the door wouldn't budge. It was locked from the outside. Panic seized her. She rattled the knob, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She ran to the windows, but they were sealed shut, as if fused to their frames. She was trapped. And then the house came alive. Books flew from the shelves, crashing against the walls. The grand piano in the parlor began to play a discordant, frantic melody on its own. The portraits in the foyer rattled, their painted eyes seeming to glow in the darkness. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, a storm of voices crying out in pain and fear. "Help us!" they shrieked. "It won't let us leave!" The spirits of her ancestors materialized around her, no longer fleeting apparitions, but solid, terrified forms. They were trapped with her, their ghostly figures pacing the room, their faces etched with an eternity of suffering. They weren't haunting her. They were warning her. They were pleading with her to do what they could not: escape. Through the cacophony of terror, Emily's own fear began to crystallize into something else: anger. Anger at this house, at this curse that had stolen the lives of so many women. Anger at the force that was trying to claim her as its next victim. She would not be another tragic story in a dusty old book. She would not be another ghost in these haunted halls. "What do you want from me?" she screamed into the darkness, her voice raw. The house answered. A single diary, her great-great-grandmother's, flew from a shelf and landed at her feet, open to a specific page. Her hands shaking, Emily picked it up, and by the flickering light of the fire, she read. The words told a story of betrayal. The house had been built by her ancestor, Silas Carter, but it was his wife, Elspeth, who had poured her heart and soul into it. She had designed the gardens, chosen the colors, filled it with life. But Silas was a cruel man, and he had a secret, a mistress he had hidden away in the town. When Elspeth discovered his infidelity, he had turned on her. In a fit of rage, he had killed her, burying her body in the foundation of the house itself, her life force, forever bound to the stone and wood. It was Elspeth's rage, her pain, her unending sorrow that had created the curse. She was the entity, the vengeful spirit that held the others captive, her agony poisoning the very air. She couldn't rest, and so she ensured that no Carter woman who inherited her beloved house would ever know peace. She saw them not as family, but as replacements, women living the life that had been stolen from her. But the diary offered a sliver of hope. A final, desperate entry spoke of a way to break the cycle. It wasn't a ritual of banishment, but one of forgiveness. Elspeth's spirit needed to be acknowledged, her story told, her pain soothed. She needed to be set free, not by force, but by compassion. The diary spoke of a hidden chamber in the cellar, built over the place where she was buried, a place where her spirit was strongest. The storm outside raged, mirroring the tempest inside the house. The doors were still sealed, the spirits of her ancestors still swirling around her in a panic. But now, Emily had a purpose. She was no longer the victim. She was the key. With a heavy iron poker from the fireplace in hand, she made her way to the cellar door. The house fought her every step of the way. The stairs seemed to stretch and warp. The air grew thick and cold, and the whispers of Elspeth's rage grew to a deafening roar. "Get out!" the voice shrieked, a sound that vibrated in Emily's bones. "This is my house." "It's our house," Emily yelled back, her voice filled with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "And I'm not leaving them with you." She found the hidden chamber, a small, bricked-up section of the cellar wall. With a poker, she began to break through, the bricks crumbling under the force of her blows. Behind it was a small earthen space, and in the center, a single silver locket, the same one she had found in the trunk. Elspeth's locket. As she stepped into the chamber, the full force of the entity hit her. The air crackled with energy, and a figure began to coalesce in the darkness. A woman in a tattered white dress, her face a mask of fury and grief, her eyes burning with a cold, spectral light. It was Elspeth. The spirits of the other Carter women huddled at the entrance, too terrified to enter. This was Emily's fight alone. "I know what he did to you," Emily said. Her voice shaking but steady, she held up the locket. "I know your story, and I am so sorry." The spirit shrieked, lunging at her, a blast of icy air throwing Emily against the wall. But she held on, her gaze fixed on the vengeful ghost. "You don't have to hold on to this pain anymore," she pleaded, pushing herself to her feet. "We can let it go. We can all be free." She opened the locket. Inside were two miniature portraits, one of a smiling Elspeth and one of a tiny baby, a child Silas had never known she was carrying. This was the source of her deepest grief, the future that had been stolen from her. Emily held it out. "He didn't just take your life," she said, tears streaming down her face. "He took hers, too. But your story doesn't have to end with his betrayal. It can end with our love. We remember you. We honor you." For a moment, the spirit's rage faltered. A flicker of confusion, of sorrow, crossed its spectral face. The house fell silent, holding its breath. Emily took a step forward, her heart pounding. She placed the open locket on the earthen floor, directly over the spot where Elspeth's bones lay. "Rest now," she whispered. "Forgive him, not for his sake, but for yours. Let go. We'll be okay." A single spectral tear rolled down Elspeth's cheek. The rage in her eyes softened, replaced by a profound, ancient weariness. She looked at Emily, then at the spirits of her descendants huddled in the doorway. A faint, sad smile touched her lips. And then she began to dissolve, not in a violent explosion, but in a gentle release like smoke caught in a sunbeam. A warm, golden light filled the chamber, pushing back the centuries of cold and darkness. The other spirits, their faces filled with awe and relief, began to fade with her, their whispered goodbyes a soft, grateful chorus on the wind. As the last of the light vanished, the house gave a final shuddering groan. The oppressive weight that had filled its halls for centuries lifted. The curse was broken. Emily stood in the sudden peaceful silence, the only sound the dripping of water somewhere in the cellar. She was alone, truly alone, for the first time since she had arrived. The doors and windows of the house swung open, letting in the clean, rain-washed air of the new dawn. She walked out onto the porch as the first rays of sun broke over the misty Vermont hills. The house behind her was no longer a tomb, but simply a house, old, decaying, in need of repair, but silent, at peace. She didn't know if she would stay and fix it, or sell it and start over somewhere new. But as she stood there, breathing in the crisp morning air, she knew one thing for certain. The ghosts of the past were gone. Her future, for the first time in a very long time, was entirely her own. She was no longer a link in a cursed chain, but the woman who had broken it, and that was a foundation she could build any life upon.